David never thought that a simple walk home from work would lead to an encounter that would change his life forever. He spotted a woman sitting alone on the sidewalk, her eyes reflecting a quiet strength despite her worn appearance. Feeling the urge to assist, he offered her a hand, unaware that this small gesture would ignite a series of events that would alter his life completely. What secret does this moment hold, and how will it redefine David's journey? Stay tuned to follow his path of compassion and discovery. Share with us where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. The vibrant city streets buzzed with the energy of rush hour as David made his way home from another long day at the office. Briefcase in hand, he maneuvered through the crowd of suits and smartphones, his mind already drifting to the comfort of his apartment and the promise of a peaceful evening. As he turned onto a quieter street, something caught his attention amidst the urban hustle. A lone figure sat on the sidewalk, her presence a stark contrast to the hurried pedestrians. David's pace slowed as he approached, his gaze fixed on the woman's cardboard sign. Fell on hard times, any help appreciated. She was black, likely in her mid-30s, with a face that told a story of both struggle and dignity. Her clothes were worn and mismatched, yet there was something in her demeanor, in the way she carried herself, that made David stop. Before he realized it, he found himself standing in front of her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Are you okay?" The woman looked up, her eyes meeting his with a directness that caught him off guard. "As okay as one can be, given the circumstances," she replied, her voice clear and articulate. David shifted his weight, suddenly aware of the gap between them. "I'm David," he offered, extending his hand before realizing the awkwardness of the gesture. To his relief, she accepted it, her grip firm despite her fragile appearance. "Lisa," she said simply. "Lisa," David echoed, searching for the right words. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but how did you end up here?" A shadow crossed Lisa's face, and for a moment, David regretted his question. But then she spoke, her tone low and measured. "Life has a way of throwing curveballs, doesn't it?" She offered a small, rueful smile. "I had a good life, a family, a career, dreams. Then tragedy struck, and it was like dominoes falling. One loss led to another, and before I knew it, I was here." David listened, captivated by the eloquence with which she spoke, even as she recounted her downfall. "What kind of tragedy?" he asked gently. Lisa's eyes clouded over. "The kind that tears families apart," she said vaguely. "I'd rather not go into details, if you don't mind. Suffice it to say, I lost everything that mattered, and getting back on your feet is not as easy as people think." David nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He'd heard stories like this before, but something about Lisa's demeanor, the intelligence shining through despite her circumstances, moved him deeply. I'm so sorry," he said, knowing the words felt inadequate. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Lisa's eyes flickered with an unreadable emotion. "You're kind to ask," she said. "But I'm not looking for handouts, just a chance to rebuild. You know." David found himself nodding again, an idea forming in his mind. Before he could second-guess himself, he blurted out, "Actually, there might be something." Lisa raised an eyebrow, curiosity evident in her expression. "I work at Thorne Industries," David continued, the words tumbling out. "We're having this big office party next week. Employees are supposed to bring a +1. But he trailed off, suddenly embarrassed. "But you don't have a date." Lisa finished for him, a hint of amusement in her voice. David felt his cheeks flush. "Right, and I was thinking maybe you'd like to come. I mean, it would be a chance for a nice meal at least. And who knows, there might be some networking opportunities." As soon as the words left his mouth, David realized how presumptuous they sounded. He hurried to add, "I'm sorry. That was probably inappropriate. I didn't mean to imply." But Lisa was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You're inviting me, a homeless woman you just met, to be your date at a corporate party?" Put that way, it did sound absurd. David ran a hand through his hair, flustered. "I know it sounds crazy, but you seem... I don't know, there's something about you, Lisa. I think you'd fit right in, and maybe it could be a chance for something good to happen." Lisa was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching David's face. Finally, she spoke, her voice tinged with a mixture of doubt and hope. "That's unexpected. But even if I wanted to go, I don't exactly have the right attire for a corporate gathering." David's enthusiasm overtook his common sense. "I could help with that," he said quickly. "We could find you something suitable. It wouldn't be anything extravagant." But he trailed off, realizing how his offer might be perceived. To his surprise, Lisa didn't seem offended. Instead, she looked thoughtful. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You don't know me. I could be anyone." David paused, considering her question. Why was he doing this? It wasn't just pity. There was something about Lisa that intrigued him, that made him want to know more. "I guess," he said slowly, "I believe everyone deserves a chance, and something tells me you have a lot to offer." "More than you might think right now." Lisa's expression softened, a glimmer of something, gratitude, hope, in her eyes. But then doubt clouded her features. "I don't want to be anyone's charity case," she said firmly. "It's not charity," David insisted. "Think of it as an opportunity for both of us. I get a fascinating +1, and you get a night off from." He gestured vaguely at the street around them. Lisa chuckled, a sound that transformed her face. "You make a compelling argument, David, but I have one condition." "Name it," David said, relieved that she was considering his offer. "If I do this," Lisa said, her voice serious, "I want the chance to repay your kindness someday. I don't know how or when, but I need you to understand that I'm not taking this lightly." David nodded, touched by her integrity. "Of course it's a deal." As they shook hands to seal their unusual agreement, David couldn't shake the feeling that he was embarking on something far more significant than a simple act of kindness. Little did he know just how life-changing this encounter would prove to be. So David said, a hint of excitement creeping into his voice, "Shall we go find you something to wear?" Lisa hesitated for a moment, then nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Lead the way, David. This should be interesting." As they set off together, an odd pair in the bustling city landscape, David felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. What had he gotten himself into? And more importantly, what surprises did Lisa have in store? The bell above the door chimed softly as David and Lisa stepped into Second Chances, a modest clothing store nestled in a quiet corner of the city. The shop's name seemed fitting for their unusual situation, and David couldn't help but smile at the coincidences. "How can I assist you today?" a cheerful voice called out. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes approached them, her gaze lingering curiously on Lisa's worn attire. David cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how strange their request might sound. "We're looking for an outfit for a corporate party," he explained, gesturing towards Lisa. "Something elegant, but not too flashy." The shopkeeper's eyebrows rose slightly, but to her credit, she didn't miss a beat. "Of course! Let's see what we can find. Follow me, dear," she said, leading Lisa towards a rack of dresses. As Lisa began to browse through the options, David hung back, feeling somewhat out of his element. He watched as she ran her fingers over the fabrics, her expression a mixture of longing and nostalgia. "See anything you like?" he asked, approaching her after a few minutes. Lisa turned to him, holding up a simple black dress. "What do you think of this one?" David studied the dress. It was elegant in its simplicity, a knee-length sheath dress with a modest neckline and three-quarter sleeves. "I think it could work," he said. "Why don't you try it on?" Lisa nodded and disappeared into the changing room. As David waited, he found himself wondering about Lisa's past, the way she carried herself, the discerning look in her eyes as she examined the clothes. It all hinted at a life very different from her current circumstances. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the changing room door opening as Lisa stepped out. David's breath caught in his throat. The transformation was astonishing. The dress fit Lisa perfectly, accentuating her figure and giving her an air of sophistication that seemed to erase all traces of her recent hardships. Her posture had changed too. She stood taller, more confident, as if the dress had awakened something within her. "Well?" Lisa asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "How does it look?" David realized he had been staring. "You look amazing," he managed to say. "Truly elegant." A faint blush colored Lisa's cheeks. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's been a long time since I've worn anything like this." As Lisa tried on a few more outfits, David found himself captivated by the glimpses of the woman she must have been before her life took its unfortunate turn. Each dress seemed to reveal a different facet of her personality: confident, playful, sophisticated. Finally, they settled on the black dress, along with a pair of modest heels and a simple clutch purse. As David paid for the items, trying not to wince at the price, which, while reasonable, was more than he'd usually spend on clothes, he couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement about the upcoming party. Over the next few days, David provided for Lisa, making sure that she had a warm place to sleep and taking care of her meals. On the day of the party, they went to a small hair salon a few blocks away.
As Lisa sat in the stylist's chair, David watched her transformation continue. The stylist worked her magic, washing and styling Lisa's hair into an elegant updo that perfectly complemented her new dress. During the styling process, David and Lisa fell into an easy conversation, sharing more about their lives than they had in their previous encounters. "So David," Lisa said, catching his eye in the mirror, "tell me more about your job at Thorne Industries. What exactly do you do there?" David leaned forward, warming to the topic. "I'm in the marketing department mostly. I work on developing strategies for new product launches, analyzing market trends, that sort of thing."
Lisa nodded, a look of interest on her face. "Sounds challenging. Do you enjoy it?" "Most of the time, yes," David replied. "But sometimes." He trailed off, unsure how to express his feelings. "Sometimes you feel like you could be doing more," Lisa finished for him. David looked at her in surprise. "Exactly. How did you know?" Lisa smiled enigmatically. "Just a hunch. Many people in the corporate world feel that way at some point."
Her comment piqued David's curiosity. "You seem to know a lot about the business world," he observed. "Did you work in that field before?" He left the question hanging, not wanting to bring up her current situation directly. A shadow passed over Lisa's face, quickly replaced by a neutral expression. "Oh, I've had some experience here and there," she said vaguely.
"You pick up things, you know?" David nodded, sensing her reluctance to elaborate. He changed the subject, telling her about some of his colleagues and the office dynamics she might encounter at the party. As the stylist put the finishing touches on Lisa's hair, David couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. The woman looking back at him from the mirror was a far cry from the one he'd met on the street just days ago.
"What do you think?" Lisa asked, turning to face him.
"You look incredible," David said sincerely. "No one at the party will believe." He stopped himself, realizing how his words might sound, but Lisa just smiled. "That I was homeless a few days ago," she finished, her tone matter-of-fact. "It's okay, David. We both know the truth, but for one night, it'll be nice to pretend, won't it?" David nodded, feeling a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. "Shall we grab some dinner?" he suggested. "We still have a few hours before the party."
They found a small, cozy Italian restaurant not far from the salon.
As they settled into their seats and perused the menus, David felt a sense of unreality wash over him.
Here he was, having dinner with a woman he'd met on the street, about to take her to his company's biggest social event of the year. It was surreal, to say the least. As they waited for their food, David found himself opening up to Lisa in a way he hadn't expected. Perhaps it was the anticipation of the evening ahead, or maybe it was just Lisa's attentive, non-judgmental presence. But he found himself sharing his deepest hopes and fears about his career. "You know," he said, twirling pasta around his fork, "I've always dreamed of doing more than just marketing.
I want to make a real difference in the company, to implement changes that could benefit not just our bottom line, but our employees and even the community."
Lisa leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest.
"That's admirable, David. What kind of changes do you have in mind?" Encouraged by her interest, David elaborated on his ideas, from implementing more sustainable practices to developing mentorship programs for underprivileged youth. As he spoke, he felt a renewed sense of passion for these long-held dreams. But he concluded with a sigh. "It's not easy to make those kinds of changes when you're just a mid-level employee. Sometimes I feel like I'm stuck, like I'll never get the chance to really make a difference." Lisa was quiet for a moment, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You'd be surprised," she said finally. "Sometimes opportunities come from the most unexpected places. The key is to be ready when they do." There was something in her tone, a hint of personal experience perhaps, that made David curious, and he couldn't help but ask again. "It sounds like you're speaking from experience," he ventured. "Did you ever work in a corporate environment?" Lisa's expression flickered, a mix of emotions crossing her face too quickly for David to interpret. I've had some experiences in that world, she said carefully. But that was a long time ago. A different life, really. David wanted to press further, intrigued by these hints of Lisa's past. But something in her demeanor made him hold back. Instead, he steered the conversation to lighter topics, and soon they were laughing over shared stories and observations about life in the city. As the evening progressed, David noticed a current of anticipation running through the crowd. He overheard snippets of conversation. "Is Mr. Thompson here yet?" Patient. "I heard he might not make it. The CEO always gives a speech at these things, doesn't he?" David turned to Lisa. "They're talking about our CEO, Robert Thompson's. He usually makes an appearance at these events, but no one's seen him yet." Lisa nodded, a strange expression flickering across her face. "Yes, I gathered as much. Tell me, David, what's he like?" Mr. Thompson considered the question. "He's intense, brilliant, of course. He built this company from the ground up, but he can be intimidating. Rumor has it, he's been going through some personal issues lately, though no one knows the details." Lisa opened her mouth as if to say something, but at that moment, a hush fell over the room. David looked up to see that Mr. Thompson had finally arrived. Robert Thompson cut an imposing figure as he strode into the ballroom, tall and distinguished, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He commanded attention without effort as he made his way through the crowd. People parted before him, offering respectful nods and murmured greetings. David felt Lisa stiffen beside him. He turned to her, concerned, and was startled by the intensity of emotion on her face. She looked afraid. Hopeful? He couldn't quite read her expression. "Lisa," he said softly, "are you all right?" But Lisa's eyes were fixed on Mr. Thompson, who was now scanning the room as if looking for someone. Suddenly, his gaze locked onto their location, and David saw the CEO's eyes widen in shock. In an instant, Mr. Thompson was moving towards them, his pace quickening with each step. The crowd parted before him, whispers of confusion rising in his wake. David felt rooted to the spot, utterly bewildered by the unfolding scene. As Mr. Thompson reached them, David opened his mouth to introduce Lisa, but the words died on his lips as he saw the look that passed between his CEO and his date, Elizabeth. Mr. Thompson's voice was barely more than a whisper, filled with a mixture of disbelief and hope. Lisa? Or Elizabeth, as David now realized, stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Mr. Thompson's face. "Hello, Robert," she said softly. The room had gone eerily quiet, everyone straining to hear and understand what was happening. David felt as if he were watching a play, completely divorced from the reality he thought he knew. Mr. Thompson reached out a trembling hand, gently touching Elizabeth's cheek as if to assure himself she was real. "Is it really you, after all this time?" Elizabeth nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, Robert, it's me. I'm sorry I've been away so long." In a move that shocked everyone present, Robert Thompson, the famously composed CEO of Thorne Industries, pulled Elizabeth into a tight embrace, his shoulders shaking with barely suppressed emotion. "You came back," he murmured loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I thought I'd lost you forever." The silence in the room was deafening. David stood frozen, his mind racing to make sense of what he was witnessing. The woman he'd known as Lisa Elizabeth had been married to Robert Thompson all along. How was this possible? As the couple separated, Mr. Thompson kept one arm around Elizabeth's waist, turning to face the stunned crowd. His face was a mixture of joy and determination as he addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice regaining its usual authoritative tone, "I apologize for my late arrival and for this unconventional scene. Allow me to introduce, or rather reintroduce, my wife." "Wife? Elizabeth Thompson?" A collective gasp went up from the assembled guests. David felt as if the room was spinning. He'd known Lisa Elizabeth for only a few days, but in that time, he'd started to care for her deeply. To discover that she was not only married, but married to a CEO was almost too much to process. Mr. Thompson continued, either oblivious to or choosing to ignore the shock rippling through the room. "Elizabeth has been away for some time. Her return is unexpected, but more welcome than I can express." Elizabeth spoke up then, her voice clear and steady despite the emotion evident on her face. "I owe you all an explanation, I'm sure, and you'll have it in time. For now, I'll simply say that I needed to step away from my life for a while to gain a new perspective. I've learned a great deal during my time away about myself and about the world we live in.
She turned to David then, a look of genuine affection and gratitude on her face. I owe a particular debt of gratitude to David here, who showed me extraordinary kindness when I was at my lowest point.
He is a credit to this company and to humanity.
David felt the weight of every eye in the room upon him.
He wanted to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions swirling in his mind, but found himself unable to form words. Mr. Thompson looked at David, a mix of gratitude and curiosity in his eyes.
"David," he said,
"I don't know the full story of how you and Elizabeth met, but it seems I owe you a great deal. We'll speak more about this later, I'm sure." As a murmur began to rise in the room, people struggling to process this unexpected turn of events, Mr. Thompson raised his voice once more.
"I know you all have questions.
Elizabeth and I have much to discuss ourselves, but for now, I ask that you respect our privacy and allow us this moment of reunion. Please enjoy the rest of the evening. There will be time for explanations later."
With that, Mr. Thompson began to lead Elizabeth away, presumably to find a more private place to talk. As they passed David, Elizabeth paused, reaching out to squeeze his hand.
"Thank you, David," she said softly, "for everything. I promise we'll talk soon." And then they were gone, leaving David standing alone in a sea of bewildered partygoers. The room quickly filled with the buzz of excited conversations as people tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. David felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Sarah, her eyes wide with disbelief. "David," she said, "what just happened? Did you know about Lisa? I mean Elizabeth?" David shook his head, still struggling to find his voice.
"No," he finally managed. "I had no idea. I really did meet her on the street."
She seemed. He trailed off, unable to reconcile the homeless woman he'd met with the poised, elegant wife of Robert Thompson. It was as if the world had suddenly tilted on its axis, leaving him struggling to find his footing. As the party continued around him, guests alternating between excited gossip and attempts at normalcy, David found himself moving in a daze towards the bar. He needed a drink, needed time to think, to process the events of the evening.
The bartender gave him a sympathetic look as he approached.
"Rough night, huh?" he said, already reaching for a glass.
David nodded, accepting the whiskey with gratitude as he sipped the amber liquid.
Feeling its warmth spread through him, he tried to make sense of his jumbled thoughts and emotions. He'd come to this party hoping to impress his colleagues, maybe even catch the eye of his superiors. Instead, he'd unwittingly played a part in a drama he couldn't begin to understand. The woman he thought he was rescuing had turned out to be someone else entirely. Someone with a past and connections he couldn't have imagined. As he stood there, lost in thought, David realized that this night had changed everything. His relationship with Lisa Elizabeth, whatever it had been, was irrevocably altered. His standing in the company, too, would likely never be the same. What happened now? Would Elizabeth keep her promise to explain? Would Mr. Thompson want to know more about how David had met his wife? And how would this affect his career? David took another sip of his whiskey, his mind swirling with questions.
One thing was for certain. Life at Thorne Industries was about to get very interesting. As the party began to wind down, David found himself in a daze, still processing the events of the evening. The ballroom, once filled with lively chatter and music, now hummed with hushed conversations and speculative whispers. Everywhere he looked, he saw small groups huddled together, no doubt discussing the shocking revelation about Elizabeth Thompson. David felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to find a young woman, her clothes worn and tattered, a cardboard sign clutched in her hands. For a moment, David was transported back to that day, half expecting to see Elizabeth's face looking back at him. But this was a different woman, her face lined with age and hardship. She looked at David warily, clearly unsure of his reaction to her presence. Without hesitation, David smiled warmly. "Good evening," he said. "Are you hungry? We have plenty of food inside from the event. Why don't you join us?" The woman's eyes widened in surprise, then filled with grateful tears as David gently led her inside. He felt a sense of fulfillment wash over him. This was why he was here. This was what it was all about. Later that night, as David prepared to leave,
he found a surprise waiting for him. A gathered crowd of Thorn employees, program participants, and community members. Mr. Thompson stood at the front, a warm smile on his face. "David," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "When you joined Thorn Industries, you were a promising young marketing executive. But you've become so much more than that. You've become a beacon of hope, a catalyst for change, and an inspiration to us all."
David felt a lump form in his throat as Mr. Thompson continued. "As you embark on this new chapter, know that you carry with you not just our gratitude, but our unwavering support. The work you've done here has changed Thorn Industries forever, and we're committed to continuing that legacy." Elizabeth stepped forward then, her eyes shining with pride. "David, a year ago you extended a hand to a stranger on the street. Today, you're extending that same hand to countless individuals across the nation. Never forget the power of that simple act of kindness." As the crowd erupted in applause, David felt overwhelmed by emotion. He looked out at the sea of faces, colleagues, friends, people whose lives had been touched by Thorn Lifeline, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All of you. What we've built here, it's not about me. It's about all of us coming together to make a difference. And that work doesn't end today. It's just beginning." As the gathering dispersed, David found himself alone in the center, taking one last look around. A voice behind him made him turn. "So this is really it, huh?" It was Tanya, the young woman who had thanked him just months ago. She was smiling, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "It is," David replied, "but it's not an ending. It's a new beginning." Tanya nodded. "You know, when I first came here, I thought my life was over. I never imagined I'd be where I am now. You gave me that chance, David. You gave all of us a chance." David felt his eyes well up. "Tanya, you did the hard work. You took that chance and ran with it. And now it's your turn to extend that hand to someone else." Tanya straightened, a look of determination crossing her face. "You're right, and I will. We all will. Your legacy here. We'll keep it going, I promise." As David finally left the center, he felt a mix of emotions. Sadness at leaving, excitement for the future, and above all, a deep sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Scaling up Thorn Lifeline to a national level would bring new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But as he drove away, his car packed for the move to his new life, David felt ready. Ready to face those challenges, ready to keep extending that hand to those in need, ready to keep believing in the power of compassion to change lives. He thought back to that fateful night, to the woman he'd met on the street who had turned out to be so much more than she seemed. Elizabeth's journey had changed her life, had changed the Thompsons' lives, had changed David's life. And now, together they were poised to change so many more lives. As he reached the highway, David's phone buzzed with a text. It was from Elizabeth. "Remember, David, this is just the beginning." David smiled, feeling a surge of determination. Yes, this was just a beginning, and what a beginning it was. The road stretched out before him, full of promise and possibility. David Anderson, once a mid-level marketing executive, now a catalyst for national change, drove on towards his future. He didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He would keep extending that hand, keep believing in the power of kindness, keep working to make the world a little bit better, one life at a time. And somewhere out there, on a street corner, in some distant city, there was someone in need, someone whose life was about to change. All it would take was one person to stop, to see them, to extend a hand. David was ready to be that person, again and again and again. The journey that had begun with a chance encounter on a city street was far, far from over now. In fact, it was just getting started. If this story touched your heart, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories of unexpected twists and acts of compassion, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.